Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the J Heritage Center's program this evening with Dr. Angela Stent. She's the author of Putin's World, most recently. I'm Kevin Peraino. I'm the executive director of the J Heritage Center in Rye, New York. And if you haven't been in person to the J Heritage Center, please come visit. It's a beautiful 23-acre estate on the shore of Long Island Sound. It was once the home of John Jay, the founding father, author of some of the Federalist Papers. One of the things people don't always know about Jay is that he was also a diplomat. He was a minister to Spain during the revolution, and he helped negotiate the end of the Revolutionary War. And so also a great diplomat and peacemaker, which is something that we can certainly use right now on this topic, Russia and Ukraine. We have a very timely program tonight about the man who has dominated Russian politics for the last 2 decades and more. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Angela Stent tonight. She is a professor at Georgetown University. She's the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies, former US intelligence official, former member of the policy planning staff at the State Department. She's the author of a book called The Limits of Partnership, US-Russian Relations in the 21st Century. And as I mentioned, her most recent book is Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. And thank you so much, Dr. Stent, for joining us tonight.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We're very lucky to have Dr. Stent tonight because not only is she getting calls from the J Heritage Center, she's getting calls from government officials who are asking her her opinion on this conflict, who know her reputation. And it is really a terrific book. I recommend it. They have it at Arcade Books here in Rye. They have it at the bookstore in Connecticut, Barrett Books. And the thing that I love about this book is we see the headlines about this war in a vacuum. And what this book does is it puts them in the context not only of the ambitions of Russian leaders over the years, but also in the context of the decisions and choices that US policymakers have made over the last 2 decades. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Stent about that context. And I want to encourage you also to ask her your questions. You can type them anytime during the program in the Q&A bubble at the bottom. You know how to do this by now. And I know you're going to have questions. People were emailing me today with questions, so feel free to type them anytime. I'll get us started with a few questions, and then I'll let you take it from there. Dr. Stent, I'll start by asking, very simple question. What does Putin want? Does he want to weaken Ukraine? Does he want to conquer Ukraine? What is his end game in this?
Well, I think his end game when he started out with this war was to conquer Ukraine. He thought it was going to be a blitzkrieg. He was ill-informed, and the stories are now coming out again from British intelligence that he doesn't know what's going on. Anyway, he was ill-informed. He thought he could take Ukraine in 3 days, that the government would surrender, and they put in charge a puppet government, a pro-Russian government, and Ukraine would say goodbye to its, if you like, European ambitions, its desire to become really a European country. But I think he wasn't going to stop there. He saw this as stage one in, first of all, the recreation of a Slavic, sort of new Slavic state, Russia, Belarus, which is very dependent on Russia now, and Ukraine. And that's the second step towards really restoring a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. For the past 15 years, it's been clear that Putin has sought to reverse the post-Cold War settlement, to relitigate the arrangements that were made once the Soviet Union collapsed. He did say in 2005 that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, a judgment with which some of us might disagree. But anyway, he explained why it was a catastrophe, and that was because 25 million Russians found themselves living outside of Russia, and 11 million of those Russians were actually in Ukraine. So he doesn't want to restore the Soviet Union, but he certainly wants to restore Russian influence control over its Western neighbors, and also over some of the other post-Soviet states. So we might say, well, that would be enough for him. But there's a third thing. If you look at the 2 so-called treaties that were presented to NATO and the United States in December of last year, really ultimatums, the Russians demanded that NATO withdraw to its military posture from May 1997. That is before Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and then later on, all of the other countries joined NATO. In other words, the suggestion is that Russia not only wants a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, but really in the countries of the former Warsaw Pact. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov a few weeks ago made the interesting statement that when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, the members of the Warsaw Pact, Central and Eastern Europe, were orphaned because they had lost Mother Russia. You can do what you want with that statement. So there are hints of that there. Now, having said all of that, clearly he can't achieve his basic objective at the moment, which is the subjugation of Ukraine. But I think that's how he started off, at least before the February 24th invasion.
It sounds like maybe not a great plan, but it sounds like a plan. And I've always thought of, when I think of Putin, as relatively, ruthless, certainly nasty, but relatively rational. You've heard a lot of a lot of talk in this conflict that, is he on steroids? Has he become unhinged? And I would put that question to you. Is he rational? Does he have rational goals right now, or has he lost it?
Well, he's certainly much more of a risk taker now than he was in the past. I mean, I would say in the past, he was cool, calculating, and pretty risk averse. So when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, I mean, the Russian army was much more powerful than the Georgian army. But they didn't take the capital, Tbilisi. They didn't depose the president, Mikhail Saakashvili, whom they loathed. They just took these two enclaves in Georgia, declared them independent, and left as a way of consolidating influence there and making it very difficult for the Georgian government to function. Even in 2014, when they annexed Crimea, that was done without practically any bloodshed. They then began the war, and don't forget, the war has been going on since 2014. It's just in a much more acute phase now. But even there, they limited themselves to this Donbas region in southeastern Ukraine. But now he seems to have thrown caution to the wind with this whole-scale invasion of Ukraine. He's clearly been isolated and alone for the past 2 years because of COVID. You've seen the pictures of him at tables, both with foreign leaders and with his own cabinet members, whether you have to sit, I think, 30 feet away from him. So he's obviously, for whatever reason, highly cautious about the possibility of catching COVID. And he appears to have been only surrounded by a few advisors from the security services and from the military who were telling him more or less what he wanted to hear, whether they understood that Ukrainians would fight back, that the Ukrainian army was much more competent than it was in 2014. They may or may not know that, but that's certainly not what they were telling him. So I'm not going to psychoanalyze him. Some people believe that he would like us to think that he's unhinged and a little crazy, so that we don't push back more than we're pushing back. Right. But certainly he is not behaving in the same way that he used to even 8 years ago.
You said you're not going to psychoanalyze him, so I might as well go ahead and ask you to psychoanalyze him. And you mentioned in the book, you say that the lens through which to look at him is not as a strategist, it is not as a chess player, but actually as a judo practitioner of judo, where the weaker power can overcome the stronger power. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it might apply to this conflict?
Sure. So I think the two things that have informed him in his life are his early career as a KGB mid-level case officer, where he got to sense people's weaknesses to try and figure out how to manipulate them. That's obviously part of what a case officer does. And then the judo champion. So in 1976, he was declared the judo champion of Leningrad, as it then was. And I have a picture in my book of the local evening paper, which said, this is a young man to look out for. He may achieve great things. Little did they know then. So the judo part of it, I think, really is understanding how to get the better of an opponent who might be stronger than you. But you have to understand how distracted he is, where his weaknesses are. And I think he has definitely applied that to the West. On the one hand, he behaves in a very disruptive way. I mean, this is an extreme form of it now, but in general, Russia tends to, its playbook is to disrupt the West, to try and figure out the cleavages, say, in the Western alliance or within Western countries. And I think Putin, one of the reasons he invaded now was he definitely looked at the United States. He looked at the way that we had withdrawn from Afghanistan. He looked at the deep polarization here, the fact that President Biden is having a hard time getting his legislative agenda through. He looked at Europe. He saw a new German government that was trying to figure out how the coalition was going to function. Britain distracted by Brexit. So he thought that he saw all of these weak points within Europe and the United States and within the Western alliance. Again, going back to the Trump years when obviously US-European relations were really hit at rock bottom. And he thought, again, that he could just pounce and prevail then because we would all be distracted. So I think those judo skills do inform the way that he looks at the world. I do not see him as a great strategist, but he seems to be, or has been until now, a fairly clever tactician. I think one can question now how good a tactician he is, given what's happening, but it's also possible that he isn't fully aware of what's happening in this war.
What kind of report card would you give the Biden administration in dealing with this so far? What have they, this policy of sending weapons but not troops, not a no-fly zone? What do you think they've been doing well, and what do you think ought to be done differently?
Well, I think what they did very well was really getting the allies on board. I think it was very clever to start revealing intelligence, as early as October when they saw these troops amassing around Ukraine, to put out a lot of that intelligence, to tell their skeptical allies, the Germans didn't really want to believe it. We know this. And then also to tell the Russians. CIA Director Bill Burns went to Moscow, he met with Putin, and he said, we know what you're doing. So to put them on notice that we knew what they were doing, and then get our allies to agree that really something very serious was happening. So I think forging allied unity, and they've been consulting consistently, constantly with all of our allies in Europe, and I think that's worked out. And I think the second thing, and it's part two of that, was to get the allies to agree to these very, very tough sanctions. I mean, if you told me 6 months ago that you would have got Germany closing down a natural gas pipeline that was supposed to open from Russia, Nord Stream 2, that you would have gotten Europeans to agree with sanctioning the Russian central bank, ejecting some of the banks from the SWIFT system. I mean, the Europeans have not gone as far as we have, which is to stop importing Russian oil and gas because they're much more dependent on it. But the vice chancellor in Germany, the economics minister, who of course is from the Green Party, has said that Germany wants to wean itself off Russian gas in the next couple of years. So I think all of those things they did very well. I'm not convinced that it was the right thing to say right from the beginning, there will be no US soldiers there. We will not NATO will not get directly involved in this war, because it removes any kind of strategic ambiguity. And I understand why the administration did that. We're all aware that Russia is the other nuclear superpower, and that any direct clash with Russia could, involve people in the thermonuclear war. So I think that there are reasons why they said that, but perhaps if they hadn't said it, there might have been more ambiguity there. And I think the other issue where one can debate, the Ukrainians desperately want a no-fly zone, but the US and the other NATO countries are not willing to do that, because again, it's when you enforce a no-fly zone, it's possible that you could get a NATO pilot flying a plane that would then have an encounter with a Russian plane, and then who knows what would happen. And the other thing was that some of the former Warsaw Pact countries, now NATO members like Poland, were willing to supply Soviet-era fighter jets to Ukraine. The Ukrainians every day say we need more air power. And the deal would have been that the Poles would have supplied some of those, and then they would have got brand new American fighter planes to replace the old Soviet ones. And again, there was a debate in this country, and we didn't do it in the end presumably for the same reasons of caution. So it's understandable why that was done. I don't know whether the course of the war would be any different, but it means that we've essentially left the Ukrainians to fight by themselves. We are supplying them, of course, with lots of weapons, and President Biden just again today announced more weapons, anti-tank weapons, anti-missile weapons, and other countries, a lot of other NATO member countries are supplying Ukraine with weapons too. But they're still obviously very vulnerable to the superior Russian army, superior in terms of the numbers of soldiers and of military equipment.
One of the most interesting, you mentioned NATO policy, and one of the most interesting parts of your latest book, I thought, was some of the historical context on the American side, in some cases because you were actually in the room on the policy planning department, policy planning staff of the State Department, George Kennan, the great diplomat, great Russia expert, famously said the expansion of NATO was one of the most fateful errors at the end of after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you agree with that?
I do not agree with that. I think if you go back to the 1990s, you had a real problem. You had the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. You had all of these in-between countries, the former communist countries between Russia and Western Europe. And the question is, what was going to happen to them? And, you know, in the early 1990s, it was not clear that countries like Romania and Hungary, where there is a territorial dispute, you know, the Hungarians don't like the fact that Transylvania is in Romania and not in Hungary. There were other, you know, a lot of these countries were going back politically to where they were in the 1930s, when and all the disputes they had then. And so there was a real concern that you might have more wars in Europe. You'd already had, of course, the wars of Yugoslav succession. And one of the reasons for enlarging NATO was, if you join NATO, you have to renounce any of these kind of territorial claims, was to really settle some of the unsettled issues in Eastern and Central Europe. Now, we did say at the time, probably somewhat disingenuously, that this didn't represent, it wasn't against Russia, it was just to make Europe whole and free. But of course, the subtext was countries like Poland, like the Czech Republic, all of those countries that had experienced, or Hungary, you know, Soviet invasions, land grabs, things like that. They wanted to be in NATO as a protection against, you know, what we see today, which is Russian irredentism and revanchism, really. So the decision was made, instead of creating some new all-European institution, to stick with NATO, which was a successful organization, and just enlarge it. But the problem with that, and one has to admit that, was that this system didn't give Russia a stake in a stable Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Russia was outside of it. Now, there was a NATO-Russia Council that was formed in 1997. It's more or less moribund now, but Russia did have its own relationship with NATO, but Russia was not part of this system. And so, I mean, George Kennan said that because he believed that the Russian reaction to that would be, you know, what we see now. I think the answer to that is, imagine if Poland weren't in NATO. You know, what would we be seeing now in terms of what Russia is trying to recoup? So I don't believe it was a mistake. You're referring to in my book, The Limits of Partnership. We did in early 2001 think about what it would mean, because Putin had said, as Yeltsin had, could Russia join NATO? And so we laid out a plan for, if Russia really was serious in joining NATO, these are the steps it would have to take. Obviously, that didn't go anywhere. And the problem with Russia is it doesn't really like to join organizations whose rules it has to accept. It prefers to dominate organizations where it makes the rules. But so I don't think NATO enlargement was a mistake, but I know there's divided opinion on that in this country.
What do you think? What is the ideal if bringing Russia into NATO is a non-starter? If there are some downsides to enlargement of NATO, it sounds like you don't think that there are. What would the ideal security architecture look like? Is it the one that we have currently?
Well, no, because I think the one we have currently is now also will have to be revised. I mean, I think however this war ends, we're not going to be able to go on as we did before. Even, you know, NATO is not going to promise, as the Russians have demanded, that it will never enlarge again. But, you know, Ukraine itself has said it's willing to say it wants to be neutral, to give up any aspirations to join NATO. But the system isn't viable anymore. And people understand that you're going to have to go back and think about how you rethink Euro-Atlantic security. We do have the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which began in 1975 as CSE. It is an all-European organization where these issues have been discussed and could be discussed. Russia doesn't like the organization very much at the moment because it has a part of it that monitors human rights and election integrity and things like that. And obviously, Russia hasn't done very well with that. But that could be a body where you could sit down and try and rethink this. The Russians in 2008 proposed a new sort of all-European conference, and that was more or less rejected by the rest of Europe. But there will have to be, and people are thinking about that now, how can we be more imaginative going forward and creating something where Russia wouldn't then feel that it has to go and start taking territories back that used to be part of the Soviet Union.
How well prepared is NATO? And this is, I'll let this be my last question. We're already getting tons of questions in, so I want to make sure we get to these. How well prepared is NATO to defend the existing NATO countries? Because I know in 5 or 6 years ago, Rand did a report saying NATO couldn't defend Latvia if it were invaded. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I have to say I participated in one of those war games and it was pretty scary. That was just after the annexation of Crimea. So the other thing I think the Biden administration and NATO anyway has done well is to reinforce the eastern flank. I mean, the countries like Poland and the Baltic states and Romania do feel very vulnerable. They're neighbors of Ukraine. And, they had thought that they had gotten away from having to fear the exercise of Russian power so much. So we've sent more equipment, more troops. I suspect that in the end, you'll probably have permanent basing, possibly of US troops in Poland, or maybe NATO troops. So this will be, again, the exact opposite of what Putin wanted. NATO is now strengthened by this. You could say after Afghanistan, it was sort of lost its purpose. It now knows what the purpose is again. And it's recommitted to defending all NATO members, including the ones that border on Ukraine. So hopefully it is prepared. I mean, it remains true that the Baltic states are vulnerable, but there are some people who do believe that however Putin is acting now, that he does understand NATO and Article 5 guarantees and that he would respect those. Okay.
Well, I want to open it up to questions. I'll start with a provocative question from a viewer. She asks, is an internal assassination of Putin an absurd idea? If that happened, who would take over? And is the devil you know better than the one you don't?
It's a great question. And we all know what President Biden said the other day about Putin no longer remaining in power. I mean, in theory, an internal assassination is possible. But if you look at the way things are organized now, Putin, again, is surrounded by a very small group of people who, as far as we can see, are loyal to him. They owe their positions and their wealth to him. It's unclear what the incentive would be for someone, to assassinate him. Because I think then everybody knows there'd be a power struggle. If you look back in Russian and Soviet history, there were always power struggles. I mean, when Stalin died and when other leaders died. So I think it's probably unrealistic to believe that that would be possible. And so the second part of the question sort of relates to that. Who would take over? So technically, if something were to happen to Putin, the prime minister, Mr. Mishustin, would take over. But he's a technocrat. And he doesn't have his own political base. So it would presumably be one of these people around Putin who, as I said, probably share most of his views. And if they're from the military or from the security services, they might be tough or even tougher than he is. So when Russians say, things could be worse than Putin, they're right. I mean, of course, they could be better too. But it's hard to envisage at the moment a scenario where if he was somehow removed, things would get much better quickly.
Okay. You write in the book about the real cultural differences sometimes between the worldviews of policymakers in Washington and in Moscow. And a viewer, Barbara, emailed me a question today. And you write about this a little bit in your book about how Putin, we think about things in terms of Western liberalism. Sometimes he takes a Eurasian, he sometimes has kind of a Eurasian worldview, as you call it in the book. The question is, when preparing for a meeting to discuss a particular issue with a Russian representative, how much attention is given to the differences between our two cultures as to how the presentation is prepared and actually presented? I think she's talking about you as a policymaker.
Sure. I mean, that is a great question. I think probably not enough attention is paid to this. I think it's often very hard for American policymakers in general to put themselves sort of in the shoes or in the mindset of the country with which they're dealing. Or in the past, I don't think we've always been very good at that. I think, hopefully we're getting better at this now. My sense is there's been a lot more attention as the relationship with Russia has deteriorated in the last few years. Well, certainly since 2014, there has been much more attention to that and to understanding where Putin is coming from. And, he has said liberalism is dead. The Western world is dead. The Eurasian world is arising. It's going the world dominated by Russia and China. And I think the other thing is that the Russian leadership, let's put it this way, they don't really believe that the United States is a democracy. I mean, they believe, and they look at us, and obviously if they look at what's happened, I'll just mention January the 6th and various other things, they're very skeptical about it. And they think that we're motivated by the same things that they're motivated by, which is often a mistake. And for instance, they think that the US president has much more power than he indeed has, particularly over the US Congress. So that's something where they kind of mirror image the Kremlin's relationship with the Russian Duma, and they get it wrong. So we have to also understand how they view things, but also where they get things wrong, and try and communicate that this is not how our system functions.
Great question from David Parsons, also about the nature of Ukrainian nationalism. And you go into this in some detail in the chapter in your book about Ukraine. He asks, given that Ukraine has been in the Russian orbit most of the time since the days of Catherine the Great until 1991, was an early founding nation of the Soviet Union, and there appears to be no obvious topographical border to Ukraine's east, what are the major arguments that Ukraine should be independent, and where should the border be?
It's a great question. So, I mean, of course, part of Ukraine, when Putin told George Bush in 2008, Ukraine isn't a country, much of it was part of the Russian Empire, and the rest of it, belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, the western part of Ukraine, where there was always a fairly strong Ukrainian national consciousness, and where the Ukrainian language was spoken, even though they didn't call themselves Ukrainians until much later on, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that, of course, was part of Poland in the interwar years. And then the rest of the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine did have a brief period of independence, well, in the 17th century, but after the Russian Revolution for 4 or 5 years. And it's an interesting question, how come Poland was able to emerge as an independent state and Ukraine wasn't? I mean, all of these countries in this part of the world have had shifting borders. No one has had, set borders over the centuries. And the reason they didn't was because they probably weren't sort of consolidated enough. But all through the Soviet period, you did have, various Ukrainian leaders were removed, communist leaders were removed, because Moscow thought that they were sort of too nationalistic. The Ukrainian language was used in sort of limited ways. They were allowed to use the language, but the Russians were always very carefully watching this. The animus against Ukraine as an independent entity was there. I mean, in the 1930s, Stalin, created this artificial famine in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, when millions of people died, because he also wanted to kind of get rid of a future, Ukrainian intelligentsia. So there has been national consciousness there. It was submerged. But after 1991, I think what's been remarkable is that you really do have the emergence of a sense of the Ukrainian nation state. And just because, and you've seen it on television, just because a large number of Ukrainians speak Russian as their first language, including President Zelensky, who grew up speaking Russian, does not mean that they identify with Russia. They identify as Ukrainians who happen to speak Russian. And I think the analogy there is, someone in Montreal or Brussels speaks French, but they don't identify with being French. And you've seen over the past 30 years, this consolidation of national feeling. And I have to say, Vladimir Putin has helped us. I mean, particularly since 2014, with the fighting in the Donbass and the ongoing war, this consciousness has grown stronger and stronger. And so, I think that the justification for this is Ukrainians do feel that they are an independent nation, that they have a different history from Russia, which is true. Of course, you can argue about the founding of the Russian state. In my book, I have a picture of a Ukrainian and a Russian banknote, and they both have Yaroslav the Wise on it, although he looks different, because they both claim it as their founding father. I mean, there's obviously a lot of historical disputes here and historical narratives. But, they've existed as an independent country for 30 years, and they obviously are determined to continue to exist as such. And there's really no reason why they should be part of Russia. I mean, the Russian Federation is the largest country in the world, so it doesn't really need absorb another 40 million people.
Okay, thanks for the great question, David. And we have a number of questions that I might ask together about the nexus of this war and the Trump presidency. So we have James Rodriguez asks, do you think that the Donald Trump presidency made it easier for Putin to attempt this war on Ukraine? Another viewer asks, why didn't he begin the war when Trump was in power as opposed to when Biden was in power? Can you talk a little bit about Trump in the war?
Sure. So, on the campaign trail, we know with Paul Manafort at that point in a position of leadership during the campaign, who worked, of course, for the deposed Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. So on the campaign trail and in the Republican platform, basically they removed any kind of support for Ukraine. And I believe Donald Trump at one point said that he really thought that, Ukraine was sort of part of Russia. So right from the beginning, he was very dismissive of Ukraine. And later on, he claimed that the Ukrainians were trying to help Hillary win. This is after all the evidence came out about the Russian interference in the 2016 election. So on the one hand, and of course, we know that he admired Putin, he admires strong men, and he promised he wanted to have a much better relationship with Russia. And the Russians, had high hopes for him in the beginning. And I think by the end, they were disappointed because he couldn't deliver. And the reason he couldn't deliver a much better relationship was because the rest of his government didn't agree with him on this. I mean, his own National Security Council, and then the State Department and the Department of Defense and the US Congress, none of them agreed with him on this. So then, of course, Ukraine became this issue when the phone call, when it was revealed that he'd had this call with Zelensky, who had only recently come into office, tying the provision of lethal defensive aid to Ukraine. The condition was that they had to give information, dirt, if you like, on Hunter Biden's dealings. He was on the board of a Ukrainian energy company. And of course, we know that that led to the first impeachment. And then the relationship with Ukraine for the rest of his presidency was really on a very low level. But the Trump administration actually did supply Ukraine with lethal defensive weapons, which the Obama administration had refused to do. Now, why didn't Putin go into Ukraine earlier? I think in the beginning, that has something to do with Zelensky himself. When Zelensky first came into office, he promised that he wanted to make peace with Russia. He seemed much more conciliatory. And the Russians thought, this inexperienced TV comedian, we're going to be able to, rings around him, and we'll be able to get a good deal with him. Well, it turned out that it didn't work out like that, and that Zelensky had one meeting with Putin fairly early on, which did not go well. And then he got much tougher. And one of the reasons why Russia invaded now is because Zelensky had been cracking down on pro-Russian oligarchs, pro-Russian TV stations, and the leader of the pro-Russian opposition party, Viktor Medvedchuk, Putin is a godfather to his daughter and quite close to him, and Zelensky was cracking down on him and his wealth and his TV station. So that really annoyed Putin. So I would say it's not that Putin didn't invade because Trump was there, but I think the situation hadn't reached the point where he was angry enough, or let's say with the Ukrainian leadership, or where he thought that the West was weak. Because, as I say, he looks at the Biden administration and thinks it was weak. At that point, they didn't look at the Trump administration and think that it was weak. And of course, President Trump today seems to, in fact, endorse, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's pure speculation. If Trump were president today, would this have happened? I don't think we can, things would be very different anyway. But so I think that would be my answer to the Trump factor in that.
Putin's most prominent critic, Alexei Navalny, is now in prison. There have been some protests against the war in Russia. Arthur Stampleman asks, how is the Russian public reacting to the present war and the penalties the West is imposing?
So unfortunately, from our point of view, the independent polling organization Levada released a poll today, which said that support in Russia for the war has now gone up, I think, to over 70%, and Putin's personal popularity is now over 80%, which it hasn't been for years. So there seems to be, again, according to the polls. But you have to recognize that there is now a law in Russia, which is if you use the word war or invasion, or if you criticize it, you can get up to 15 years in prison. So it's also possible that when people are called on their landlines, let's say, or even more their cell phones, and ask this question, they answer accordingly. So most of the Russian public, if it's just watching state-run media, TV particularly, they are being told that this is a special military operation done to denazify Ukraine. Ukraine is a Nazi country. They never mentioned that its president is a democratically elected Jew, but it's a Nazi country. That it is committing genocide against Russians in the Donbas region, and that it has to be denazified and demilitarized. That's what they're told. And the word war isn't used, and the casualty figures that have been released are well below the Western and NATO estimates of what Russian casualties are. So the information is limited. But the shocking thing really is and we have a lot of stories about this, a lot of Russians and Ukrainians, they are mixed families. So when you have Ukrainian relatives call their Russian relatives and tell them, this is what's going on, and they show them pictures on their cell phones of the devastation in cities like Mariupol or buildings that are being bombed, their relatives in Russia don't believe it. They think it's fake news. So for whatever reason, a significant percentage of the Russian population believes that this is a just war, that this adds to Russian glory, and that Russia is doing what it did in World War II, which is to defeat the Nazis. Having said that, about 200,000 Russians or more have left since the beginning of the war. They tend to be the better educated, urban journalists, professors, doctors, things like that. A lot of them have left, and they're living either in the Baltic states, some of them are in Armenia and Georgia, a lot of them are in Turkey, or they've moved further west in Europe, and some of them are trying to come to the United States. And we know also that at least, I think, 15,000 Russians altogether have been arrested since this war began for protests. And there was a woman, for instance, who went into Red Square and she had a completely blank poster. She had nothing written on it, and they still arrested her. So there is opposition, but it's maybe not as widespread as we think. And a significant number of Russians do support this war.
You mentioned the Russian propaganda during this war about Nazis in Ukraine. There is an interesting bit of history in the book, which I hadn't known before, that part of this is it comes from the World War II history, when one of the most prominent Ukrainian nationalists actually was a Nazi collaborator.
Right. Yes, Stepan Bandera, who it was a hero and remains a hero in Ukraine, did collaborate with the Nazis. This is a fact. Again, history, it's a very complicated history. There were Ukrainians when the Nazis invaded, and of course they invaded through Ukraine. They were greeted by some Ukrainians as liberators from Russian communism, from Soviet communism. And so there were Ukrainians certainly who fought with the Nazis. And there was an organization of Ukrainian nationalists, as it was then called. And Ukraine has its own, history wars. So, during the Soviet period, all of this was, nobody talked about it, or they talked about the kind of Nazi antecedents. After Ukraine became independent, and particularly when President Viktor Yushchenko was president, the one who was poisoned as well, after 2004, they rehabilitated a number of these Ukrainians who did collaborate with the Nazis. There is also the Azov Brigade. So they are a very fierce fighting militia, and they've been fighting really in Mariupol and in the Donbas, and they've been pushing back the Russians. But they are a far-right group, and they do have links to white supremacist groups around the world. So again, it's very complicated, but they also have fighting with them people of other nationalities too. So the Nazi question is a complicated question, but to characterize Ukraine itself as being dominated by Nazis is completely untrue. And in the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament, the far-right parties are very, very small. Most of the political parties there are, somewhere in the center.
Putin, pretty early on in the war, threatened to use nuclear weapons or hinted that he might. We have a question from a viewer, a few questions about that statement. Is the use of sarin chemical gas or a nuclear attack a real possibility? Do you see that happening?
So I think, the administration here and people in Europe do see this as a possibility. The Russians have used chemical weapons before. So there is a concern that they might use chemical weapons in Ukraine. We know that President Biden has said, and all the allies have said, if these were used, there would be a very strong response. Nobody has told us what it would be for obvious reasons. Then I think the other concern is that Putin has made these veiled hints about, if you keep piling sanctions on us, we will use methods that you haven't dreamt of for a long time. In the past few years, Russian, political experts, etc., have been writing things about the possibility of a limited nuclear war, the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which of course wouldn't affect the United States, but they certainly affect the region there. And so there is some concern that could happen. But there are other people who believe on the nuclear part of it that, Putin may have his own particular view of the world, but he's not completely irrational. And to believe that there could be a limited nuclear war that would not escalate to something global, would be a highly risky proposition, and he wouldn't want to test it. So I think that the concern is more about the chemical weapons. Now, the other thing is, in general, when Russians accuse people of doing something, then they're doing it themselves. So there's been this whole fuss about, biomedical labs in Ukraine. The Russians have said that the United States, the CIA, is working with the Ukrainians, to develop biological weapons. What the US is doing and has done since the collapse of the Soviet Union is to work with Ukraine and other countries in the post-Soviet space, including Russia in the beginning, to make sure that these labs that they had in the Soviet times remain safe, and to lessen the danger of any of these things getting out. It's part of something that was called the Non-Lugar program, Senators Non-Lugar, that goes back to the 1990s. So there is also some concern, would the Russians possibly use biological weapons? Again, one hopes that this wouldn't happen, but I think nobody thinks that you can completely rule it out.
Let me ask also on the flip side of that coin, on the Ukrainian side, you point out in the book that what was it, 25 years ago, Ukraine was convinced to give up its own nuclear weapons, and now look what's happened to Ukraine. What lesson, what kind of example is that for, in the context of non-proliferation?
Right. So, in 1994, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear country in the world after the Soviet collapse. There were, many, many warheads in Ukraine. And, Bill Clinton and, persuaded both, the Ukrainian leadership to eventually to give up these nuclear weapons. And he had to persuade Yeltsin actually to meet with the Ukrainian president, because that was already admitting that Ukraine, was a separate country. And then there was this famous Budapest memorandum that was signed by the United States, by Russia, by Ukraine, by Great Britain, which gave assurances, not guarantees, to Ukraine that if it gave up its nuclear weapons, its territorial integrity and sovereignty would be respected by all the signatories. Well, we know what happened to that. So I think people are very concerned that this war really will incentivize people to go to nuclear proliferation. In other words, look what the Ukrainians did. They gave up their nuclear weapons and they were invaded by Russia. If they still had nuclear weapons, presumably this wouldn't have happened. So I think this will be something to look for in the future. You already have Japan talking now about wanting nuclear guarantees from the United States. There are countries like Saudi Arabia, other countries that might aspire to acquire nuclear weapons, and that might be the lesson that they take away from this. So I think that this does have very potentially unfortunate ramifications for that. And I think it's something that all the nuclear powers will have to pay a lot of attention to going forward.
I like this question from a viewer. She's asking, if you had a chance to speak with Putin, what would you say? Is there anything you could say that would make a difference?
A number of people in this country have been wondering, who could one send to talk to President Putin as a kind of an off-ramp? I mean, various European leaders are talking to him. I think President Macron talks to him very frequently. And Henry Kissinger used to go and meet, periodically with Putin. but that's not possible anymore. I mean, what would one say to him? I think he has to understand, which he doesn't, that Ukrainians consider themselves a separate nation and a state, that they don't necessarily want to have an antagonistic relationship with Russia. They would be perfectly happy to live with Russia and have, a neighborly relationship, whatever that would be. I think the fact that the Ukrainians are willing to say that they would, will be neutral going forward, that they will eschew trying to join NATO. That's one of the Russian demands. Well, the Ukrainians are willing to accept that, and they're willing to discuss over a longer period the status of Crimea and the Donbass. So I think the argument would be take those things, withdraw the troops, the status of these other territories can be worked out. And then, the sanctions will begin to be lifted. And if Russia's goal, is to be, and under Putin it has been always, to be a member of the global board of directors and that no important decision in the world should be taken without Russia, they've done the exact opposite with this by making themselves isolated. If they want to get back and be a more influential global power, that's what, they should realize that that's the way to do it. Now, you could say all those things to him. He clearly doesn't accept or believe them, but that would be the way to go.
I think we know a lot by now about Putin's character and ruthlessness, the Litvinenko, all these individual incidents. There's one incident you mentioned in the book. I'm not sure if everybody has had this story. Will you tell the story about Angela Merkel and the dog?
Oh yeah. Yes, that's what you call, power politics. So Angela Merkel, the chancellor, it was known that she had a fear of dogs because she was apparently bitten badly by a dog when she was a child. So on one of her first meetings with Putin in Sochi, in his residence there, and this is all on video, she was brought into a room where she sat down. And at that point, Putin had just entered the room. And then suddenly Putin has had this big black Labrador called Connie. And the dog bounded into the room and, went up to Angela Merkel and wanted to lick her and say hello to her. And so you look at Merkel's face, and she obviously, she's a tough woman. And so she didn't flinch, but you just look at the expression in her eyes. And after that, she said, obviously he's a good KGB agent. He knew exactly what to do. And afterwards she said, this is really a mark of how little he is in terms of just his ability to, act in a kind of civilized human way, that he really wanted to humiliate her, and she understood that. So, but that is quite a remarkable and a well-known incident.
It is. I wanted to ask you about the Russia-China relationship and what's that like now? How has the invasion affected that relationship, and has it made it more likely or less likely that Beijing would try something like this in Taiwan, for instance, or another of the peripheral territories?
So I don't think that Putin would have undertaken this invasion if he didn't know that he could rely on Chinese support. He went to China on February the 4th, the opening of the Beijing Olympic Games, and he and Xi Jinping came out with this long statement saying that their relationship was even better than an alliance. There are no heights to which it couldn't climb. And in that declaration, the Chinese supported all of Russia's grievances, that NATO was a threat to Russia, that the United States was a threat to Russia, and that there had to be indivisible security for all, not just for one. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese ambassador to the United States published an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, we didn't know that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. He didn't tell our president that, and so don't tell us that we knew what was going to happen. You can take that, you can believe it, you cannot believe it, you can be skeptical. It is quite possible that Putin did not convey that there was going to be a whole-scale invasion of Ukraine. You might have thought that the Chinese might have understood that there was going to be at least a partial invasion. And we also know from our own media that the United States was briefing the Chinese, was giving them also some of this intelligence about what the Russians were doing. And apparently the Chinese said that they didn't believe it. So I do not think, on the one hand, that this is what the Chinese wanted to happen. I mean, the specter of a large-scale war in Europe, The Chinese have a perfectly good relationship with Ukraine. It's part of the Belt and Road Project. They're one of the biggest trade partners of Ukraine. So, you know, they wouldn't want to see Ukraine sort of razed to the ground. But also more generally, they have very important economic relations with Europe and with the United States. And all of these sanctions that have been imposed as a response to this, China is complying apparently with some of them. There may be other ways where it's trying to support Russia, but this is not what it wanted. And so you have the Chinese still formally supporting what Russia's doing. And Mr. Lavrov was in Beijing yesterday for a conference in Afghanistan. And again, the Chinese came out and said, you know, we fully support our Russian, you know, comrades in this special military operation. Now, looking at, and then they pointed out, however, that China supports territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries, including Ukraine. They said that on numerous occasions. And they said there's no analogy to Taiwan because Taiwan is part of China, and therefore it's not a question of its territorial integrity or sovereignty. You might think that in Beijing, looking at how the Ukrainians are fighting, and after all, Taiwan has a close defense relationship with the United States, they might think twice about what a military incursion into Taiwan would look like. We don't know that. And I think they have their own timetable for when they think that, you know, Taiwan's going to be reunited with China. But I think it would give them pause. And I think as this war goes on, it's going to be more difficult for China to kind of maintain this position of total support for Russia, just because there'll be these countervailing pressures, including the sanctions.
Putin loves to complain about American meddling in his neighborhood, and diplomats who have met him say he begins every meeting with a diatribe about American meddling in what he considers his sphere of influence. There have been there was the leak of the State Department official Victoria Nuland's comment that talking about pro-Russian figure Yanukovych and which of his opponents should we support. Obviously, USAID has put money into the region as well. Does Putin have any? Does he have a case? How much are we meddling in his neighborhood?
Well, I mean, so if you know, we certainly have supported Ukraine. I mean, ever since the Soviet collapse, Ukraine has gotten a significant amount of American economic assistance. Don't forget that for a long time, Ukraine has had its own special relationship with NATO, just as Russia has. But for a long time, Ukraine was a neutral country. It was enshrined in the constitution. It's only after really the events in Crimea that Ukraine then said it wanted to join NATO. If you go back to the Orange Revolution in 2004, clearly we had USAID was just supporting Ukraine, and you had US NGOs, the Open Society Organization, George Soros, who the Russians love to hate, and they claimed in that revolution, when Yanukovych was defeated and Yushchenko took power, they claimed that there was this conspiracy between George Soros and George W. Bush via the US government, obviously understanding nothing about US politics. But certainly the US was involved in 2004 in trying to ensure that the election in Ukraine was as free and fair as it could be, because it was a work in progress. So clearly the US has been involved there. And then, after the annexation of Crimea, during the Maidan revolution in 2013 and 14, Victoria Nuland, in fact, did visit the protesters on the Maidan with Senator John McCain. She did have this conversation that was leaked. Obviously, the US, again, was supporting the forces that were protesting, the corruption that they saw and everything else. So yes, the US has been involved in Ukraine, but what it's done is support those forces that would like Ukraine to be less corrupt. And Ukraine is a very corrupt country, and that's one of the efforts. And when Biden was vice president and he had the Ukraine account, that's one of the things he was trying to impress on the Ukrainians, that they really had to tackle corruption there. So to tackle corruption and try and have, a political system that was more transparent, yeah, the US has been involved in that. And I think one of the great threats that Putin feels from Ukraine is that Ukraine is moving towards being a much more viable democracy. I mean, right now, maybe it's a more messy democracy, but it has competitive elections. It has relative freedom of expression. And that really is a threat to Putin, that a neighboring country where they speak the same language as you do has a political system that's much freer and where people aren't, where the system isn't as repressive. And so he naturally sees the US and particularly its special services as instigators of that. He doesn't want to believe that the Ukrainians could do this at their own volition.
Do you think there's any chance as a result of this that Russia will lose its seat on the Security Council?
I would find that very hard to imagine because, the Chinese are going to back them up. I don't even know. Presumably, if it were to lose its seat, everyone would have to agree that it was going to lose its seat, or the permanent members would, and the Chinese aren't going to do that.
Okay. We have several questions that about the end game. We have Daniel asks, how will this end? Somebody else asks, will a democratic Ukraine survive? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, well, I think we would all like to know what the end game is. At the moment, I have a situation where the Russian military is doing much worse than it thought it would. They didn't prepare all of these young recruits for what they were going to do. They don't have a mission. They don't know why they're there. And the Ukrainians have a mission. They know what they're fighting for. They're fighting for their own land and their own country. But on the other hand, the Russians have superior firepower. So this could go on for a long time, and you've seen the complete razing of Mariupol, desperate situation there, and other cities, and so that would be terrible. So clearly, Ukraine would like to find a way of ending this, where there is a peace settlement and where Ukraine is willing to make concessions. And so, as Zelensky has said, again. We can be neutral, but we want security guarantees. And that's a problem because the security guarantees that Ukraine would like would be basically the same as NATO Article 5 guarantees. In other words, the people who guarantee its territorial integrity and sovereignty would then have to come to its defense if it were invaded again. But there are things out on the table there. But the Russians really haven't agreed to do anything. The Ukrainian conditions for doing this are that the Russians withdraw their troops at least to where they were on February the 23rd, again, leaving the issue of the Donbas to be resolved in the future, and Crimea. So you've had these negotiations taking place most recently in Istanbul yesterday. The Ukrainians, I think, are serious about trying to come to some agreement with the Russians, at least having a ceasefire. So far, every ceasefire that the Russians have agreed to they've then violated, and they fired on people trying to escape through these humanitarian corridors. But apparently the talks are now going to continue virtually. So the outlines of a potential settlement are there, but the question is, are the Russians willing to accept that? Putin could even take that and declare victory. He could say, look, we demanded that Ukraine not join NATO. It's not going to join NATO. We demand that it denazify. Well, they can say they denazified Ukraine, whatever that means. What they haven't been able to do is to change the government, obviously. But he could come away and present, and the Ukrainians are willing to talk about the status of the Donbas. So he could come away from this declaring victory. But he doesn't seem to be in any mood to do that at the moment. So that's really the wild card. You get the Russian negotiators on the ground saying we've made progress. Then this is contradicted by his press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, who says, no, we haven't made any progress. And then the Russian negotiators are not really empowered. They don't have direct lines to Putin, whereas the Ukrainian negotiators do have direct lines to Zelensky. So, this process will continue, but we'll have to see whether the Russians are serious about it or just using negotiations as a means to gain leverage. Otherwise, you could also see a conference, a conclusion to this war temporarily. You could see a ceasefire, but then it could, hostilities could resume at some point in the future. It could be another sort of frozen conflict, which isn't really frozen. And that, of course, would be very difficult for Ukraine. Then you have to think about who pays for reconstruction. Well, it's going to be the West, but now the Western countries are saying Russia is going to have to pay for this reconstruction in terms of the money that we now have by freezing the central bank reserves. We have this Russian money, and some of that would have to go towards reparations for Ukraine, which the Russians won't want to do, or reconstruction, we should call it. Not reparations is not a good word. So it's hard to see exactly how this ends, and it may not end with a finality. It may end but then continue in some other form.
Well, believe it or not, it is 7 o'clock. I don't know where the last hour went, and we could talk about this all night. You probably can't, but I will just ask in closing. I mean, one of the things that I think people have found so disconcerting about this particular war is that in a larger sense, it feels sometimes like that whole post World War II order that the George Kennans and the Dean Achesons put together and has lasted and done a very good job over the last 70 years is fraying, and that this worldview that Putin has, this kind of 19th century power politics worldview, is ascendant. Do you think, is that the case, or is that an illusion created by this war and other events?
I mean, we don't fully know that, but I would say it's that whole post-war era of rules which we all accepted. And then the post-Cold War era, Russia signed on to all kinds of documents, which it's now, violated all of the things that it signed. It looks as if it's fragile. And I think it won't be easy to reconstruct it. You can't pretend that this didn't happen. An unprecedented, unprovoked attack on a country in the middle of Europe, a country of 40 million people. You're just sort of breaking all the rules, and the Russians not being truthful about what's happening and what they're doing. So I think that order is severely challenged, and I think we can't expect that we will easily go back to it once this war is hopefully over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stent, for being with us tonight. This is a fascinating conversation. I really do recommend the book, Putin's World. There's a lot more in this. I just want to let people know before we go, we have a couple of programs coming up. We have one next week on Wednesday, April 6th. And this is about Emily Dickinson. We had a TV show on Apple TV Plus called Dickinson, film at the J Estate last year for 2 months. It's a really fun show. We're going to have some of the actors from the show and a historian to talk about the real life history behind that show. That's next week. And then in May, on May 6th, we'll have Nathaniel Philbrick, the great National Book Award winning historian, and his daughter, Jenny Philbrick McCardle, who's a Rye resident. They're going to be talking about sunfish sailing, actually. They're both sunfish sailing. So that's going to be a really fun program as well. Dr. Stent, thanks so much. I hope you come back and visit us in person in better times. And thank you, everybody, for your really wonderful and insightful questions.
Well, thank you too. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the questions.
Good night, everybody.